Palm Desert, California, February 25, 1995, 8:47 p.m. The limousine is parked outside the Barbara Sinatra Children's Center Gala. Inside, 800 people are waiting. They are dressed in black tie. They have paid thousands of dollars for their seats. They have come because Frank Sinatra is supposed to perform tonight. Frank Sinatra is sitting in the back of the limousine. He has been sitting there for 11 minutes. His wife Barbara is beside him. His doctor is on the phone. And Frank Sinatra, the man who once walked onto stages in front of 50,000 people with the casual authority of a man entering his own living room, cannot make himself open the door. He is 79 years old. His hands are trembling. His mind, which has carried the lyrics of 1,000 songs for 60 years without a single prompt card, is beginning to betray him. Words that have lived in his memory since 1940 are disappearing. Melodies that he sang before some of the people in that ballroom were born are going quiet. The chairman of the board is sitting in a limousine in the California desert, and he is afraid. Not of the audience. Frank Sinatra was never afraid of an audience. He is afraid of himself, of what he might forget, of what they might see. To understand that night in Palm Desert, you have to understand what the voice meant, not just to the audience, to Frank. Frank Sinatra had been many things in his life: a husband 4 times, a father, a friend, sometimes loyal beyond reason, an enemy, sometimes dangerous beyond sense, a political animal, a mob associate, a Hollywood star, a recording artist of almost supernatural gifts. But underneath all of it, before all of it, he was a voice. He had discovered it as a teenager in Hoboken, New Jersey, this instrument that lived inside him, this thing that could communicate emotion with a precision that words alone could never achieve. He had spent 60 years learning how to use it, how to shape a phrase, how to sit inside a note just long enough to break a heart, how to swing a lyric so hard that a room full of strangers felt like they were flying. The voice was not just his career, it was his identity. It was the thing that made him Frank Sinatra rather than just another kid from Hoboken who wanted something better. And now it was going. Not all at once, not dramatically, the way these things always go, gradually, then suddenly. A note that used to come easily now required effort. A phrase that once flowed now had to be navigated carefully, like a man walking on ice. The range that had once stretched effortlessly across 3 octaves was narrowing, year by year, to something smaller and more fragile. Frank had been fighting it for years before that night in Palm Desert, fighting it privately, with the particular ferocity of a man who has never accepted limitation in any form. The decline had begun, quietly, in the late 1980s. Those who worked closely with Frank noticed it first, not in the performances, which he could still control through sheer will and experience, but in the rehearsals. The moment when the cameras were off and the audience was gone, and it was just Frank and the musicians in an empty room. He was forgetting lyrics. Not consistently, not dramatically, a word here, a line there, gaps where there had never been gaps before. Frank, who had prided himself on never using a teleprompter, never needing a cue card, never losing his place in a song, Frank was losing his place. He handled it the way he handled everything he couldn't control, by controlling everything around it. Teleprompters began appearing at his concerts, positioned carefully so that only Frank could see them. Set lists were shortened. Songs that required the highest notes were quietly retired. The audience, who loved him, either didn't notice or chose not to. But Frank noticed.
Every night,
every song. The gap between what he had been and what he was becoming grew wider, and only Frank could measure it precisely, because only Frank had known exactly what he once was. In 1993, he released his final album, Duets. It was a commercial triumph, pairing Frank with the biggest names in contemporary music: Barbra Streisand, Tony Bennett, Bono, Natalie Cole. Critics praised it. It sold millions of copies. What few people knew at the time was that Frank had recorded his vocals largely alone, in short sessions, because he could no longer sustain the stamina that longer recording had once required. The duet partners, for the most part, were recorded separately, and their vocals woven together in post-production. Frank Sinatra, who had once recorded entire albums in a single evening session, was recording in fragments. The 1994 World Tour, billed as the Diamond Jubilee Tour, marking 60 years in the entertainment business, should have been a triumph. In many ways, it was. Frank performed at Radio City Music Hall in New York. He performed at the Royal Albert Hall in London. He performed for the Pope at the Vatican. He performed in Japan, in Australia, in South America. The audiences came in their tens of thousands. They stood and cheered. They wept. They watched a 78-year-old man walk onto a stage and do something that no one else on earth could do: communicate, with a voice and a phrasing and a particular quality of feeling that was entirely his own, what it meant to have loved and lost and survived and kept going. But behind the scenes, the tour was managed with increasing anxiety. There were nights when Frank lost his place in a lyric and the band had to adjust around him. There were nights when he needed to sit on a stool halfway through the set, the stool that had appeared on stage without announcement, without explanation, simply there because the doctors had said it needed to be there. There were nights when the set was cut short, and the audience was told only that Frank was tired. And there were nights when Frank stood at the microphone and sang with something approaching his old power, and the people in the room understood that they were witnessing something rare and finite, and they held very still, as though any movement might disturb it. On February 25, 1994, exactly 1 year before the Palm Desert Gala, Frank Sinatra had performed at the Fukuoka Dome in Japan. It was the final concert of the Diamond Jubilee Tour. Nobody knew it at the time. Nobody knew that Frank Sinatra had just performed his last full concert. The year between Japan and Palm Desert was difficult. Frank's health declined in ways that went beyond the voice. His memory, always unreliable in the ordinary details of life but perfect for music, was becoming unreliable there, too. There were evenings when he didn't recognize people he had known for decades. There were mornings when the world seemed unclear to him in ways it hadn't before. His wife Barbara managed his public appearances with increasing care. His doctor managed his medications. His staff managed everything else. And Frank, who had spent his entire adult life managing everything himself, who had controlled his career, his image, his relationships with the iron authority of a man who trusted no judgment but his own, found himself being managed. This was, in some ways, harder than anything else. Frank Sinatra had always believed that a man defined himself by what he could do, by the quality of his work, by the standard he held himself to. He had fired musicians for playing below that standard. He had walked out of recording sessions that weren't right. He had refused to release records that didn't meet his criteria, even when they were good enough by anyone else's measure. Now the standard was the problem. Because Frank still knew exactly what the standard was. He simply could no longer meet it. February 25th. 1995. The Barbara Sinatra Children's Center Gala, Palm Desert. Frank had agreed to perform as a favor to his wife, who had founded the Center for Abused Children. It was a cause he believed in. It was a room full of friends, supporters, people who loved him. It was supposed to be manageable. He had rehearsed. He had prepared. He had told himself and everyone around him that he was ready. And then he was sitting in the limousine, and he could not make himself go inside. What happened in those 11 minutes has never been fully described by anyone who was there. Barbara Sinatra has spoken about that period of Frank's life with great tenderness and great privacy. What is known is that Frank eventually got out of the limousine, that he walked into the gala, that he sat at a table and spoke to people and seemed, to those who didn't know him well, like Frank Sinatra. And then he was announced, and the room rose to its feet, and Frank Sinatra walked to the microphone. He sang 3 songs. Those who were there have described it in different ways. Some say he was remarkable, that the voice, diminished as it was, still carried something that no other voice on earth carried. Some say it was painful, that the gaps were visible, that the effort was audible, that the man at the microphone was clearly not the man they had seen 20 years earlier. All of them agree on one thing, that when Frank Sinatra finished his 3rd song, he stood for a moment at the microphone and looked out at the room. And then he walked off the stage. He never performed again. Frank Sinatra spent the last 3 years of his life in Palm Springs, in the house he had lived in for decades. He was surrounded by his family. He watched television. He listened to music, not his own, mostly. He sat in the California sun. The man who had filled Madison Square Garden could not always remember the names of people he had known for 40 years. The man who had recorded over 1,000 songs could not always remember the words to his own. But there were moments. Those who were with him in those years speak of them with a particular wonder, when something would come back, a melody heard on the radio, a familiar chord, and Frank would begin to sing, quietly, almost to himself. And for a moment the voice was there, not diminished, not fragile, but there, the way it had always been, carrying something that could not quite be named. Then the moment would pass, and Frank would be quiet again. Frank Sinatra died on May 14, 1998. He was 82 years old. The cause of death was a heart attack. At his funeral, his daughter Nancy placed a bottle of Jack Daniels and a pack of Camel cigarettes in his pocket. A roll of dimes. Frank had always carried dimes, for the payphones he used to call people he loved, was placed in his hand. He was buried at Desert Memorial Park in Cathedral City, California. His headstone reads, "The best is yet to come." It is the title of a song he loved. It is an act of defiance from a man who never quite accepted that anything was finished. And perhaps he was right. Because every night, in living rooms, in concert halls, and late-night bars across the world, someone puts on a record, and the voice comes out of the speakers, not diminished, not fragile, not struggling with memory or age or the weight of a long life, just the voice, exactly as it was, exactly as it will always be, telling whoever is listening what it feels like to be human, to love something, to lose it, to keep going anyway. That is what Frank Sinatra left behind. Not the tuxedos, not the Rat Pack, not the mob stories or the marriages or the Hollywood feuds. The voice, still singing, long after the limousine door finally opened, long after the last song ended, long after the silence came.